Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of Dhaka Tribune's Literary Adda. I'm Rifat Munim, the literary editor of Dhaka Tribune. Today, we have invited a guest who is a well-known literary figure in South Asia and beyond. His name is Arunava Sinha, one of India's biggest translators. He translates Bengali fiction, poetry, and non-fiction into English. He has so far translated over 60 books. It won't be an exaggeration to say that he has single-handedly taken Bengali literature to great heights through his translations. Recently, he has also emerged as a translator who renders English fiction into Bengali, which sets him apart from most of his peers. Today's Adda is occasioned by the publication of his recent translation of Akhtaruzzaman Elias's magnum opus, Khwabnama. This novel is regarded by many as the most exquisitely written novel in the history of Bengali fiction. While talking about it, Hasan Azizul Haq, Shirajul Islam Chaudhry, Mohashada Devi, and Shankar Ghosh, among many others, called it the best novel written in Bengali. So today, we hope to engage Arunava Sinha in a conversation about his experience of translating Khwabnama, and also about other aspects related to this wonderful book, including the attention it may get internationally now that it is translated.
Thank you very much for having me this evening, Rifat, and thank you for your kind words.
You deserve all those words. So my first question would perhaps be the shortest. What made you select this novel for translation?
I don't think I had to select the novel. The novel selected itself. It was more a matter of when I could muster enough courage to try my hand at it. And I knew from the moment that I had read it, that this was a novel that people all over the world had to read. I never thought at that point, because I was not a translator then, or not a professional translator then, that I would get a chance to do it. But ever since I actually started translating on what I call an industrial scale, which was around 2007, it was always on my mind that one day I will have to, if possible, if no one has done it yet, one day I will get to this book. But every time I thought about it, I felt I wasn't ready. And eventually I realized a couple of years ago that I would perhaps never be ready. It's such a daunting thought that I said, fine, let's just take courage in our hands and let's see what comes of it. So that's how I actually went about it. But it was always there in my head as a book to be translated.
So the main reason is because you found this book fascinating, and you are not alone there. A lot of us, including some of the biggest writers writing from Bangladesh and Kolkata, have also thought along the same line. So before we move on to the next question, I think our audience would be benefited if you give a brief description of what the novel is about. I mean, we know that it is about the 1947 partition of India, and that it is set in a remote village by the Jamuna River in erstwhile East Bengal. But maybe something just a little about the main characters and what are the main features of the story?
Well, critics and scholars and students and readers have done a much better job of this than I ever could. But I can only talk about what struck me when I read the novel. For one thing, I'm a Niger body. I am from my ancestral roots go back to East Bengal, specifically to Mymonsingh, on both sides of my family. So, and no matter where you live, you never quite shed those roots. So they're very much there in my head. So when I read this novel, I knew that this was close, although it wasn't exactly where my ancestors used to live. It was close enough for me to feel a sense of kinship. But I think for me, the most amazing thing about this novel, which is set, as you said, in this community of fishermen primarily, but also it's foregrounded by this family of fishermen, which consists of Tamiz and Tamiz's father, Tamiz's Bap, who doesn't even have a name, but who really stands for so many things in this novel, because he is a true embodiment of hunger, and someone who inhabits the novel like its spirit animal, as it were. And Tamiz himself is a fisherman who, however, wants to be a cultivator. I mean, he's from fisherman stock, but he is a cultivator. He wants to be a cultivator, and his dream, like that of so many other cultivators, was to own a little bit of land of his own that he can farm for himself. but he, of course, is part of the, I mean, a victim, you might say, of the feudal structure where the landowners call the shots and then they lease out the land to these middlemen who actually exploit the people who are actually working on the field. And the historical backdrop is the Tebaga movement, where the farmers wanted 2/3 of the harvest for themselves, and that 1/3 should go to the owner of the land. And but these are all things that we know. This would make for a fascinating work of history, but that's not what this novel is. It is, at the end of the day, a work of fiction. And I think it does so many, set around this community. It creates a huge mythology from the most unlikely people. You would normally not associate a mythology being created with peasants. So it is really a subaltern mythology in that sense. And the story goes over and above anything that mere politics or mere history can encompass. It is a fascinating way of looking at how memory works, how memory manifests itself in people, not just individually, but also collectively. It shows that what we consider the real world or the physical world is actually a severe restriction of our own imagination. That the world which the people of this novel inhabit is what, in some literary schools, it will be called a work of magical realism. But to me, this is a work of realism. It's not about magical realism. This is how the world is conceived by the people in this novel. And that world actually exists well beyond what our five senses can normally bring to us. So the rest of the world is contributed by the imagination, by memory, by a sense of myth, by music, by legends, by this book, Khwabnama, which is a book within the book, which only one or two experts can read and interpret your dreams with the help of, to tell you what lies in your future. So it's a huge canvas, and it's a canvas that in some way leads you to a reality that you cannot inhabit really in your everyday world. So that is what great art does, right? It takes you to a different place where when you go there, you realize, but this is indeed where I am. This is my world. And I have not actually read any book that does this so seamlessly and effortlessly with such miraculous ease. I mean, the Latin American tradition of magical realism is very in-your-face magical realism. It almost takes you into that Arabian, the world of 1001 stories and so on, where it's almost the equivalent of magic carpets and things. Even Salman Rushdie took this up. But here, you move so seamlessly from what you know rationally to what you know through other means, that you almost don't realize when you've crossed that line. When Tamiz's father, Tamiz's Bap, he goes out, he sleeps, and then in his sleep he goes out. Now he goes out and he does things. Now, are you going to put a rational explanation to this and say he's a somnambulist, or are you going to say no, something else is happening here? That's how easily it moves between what we call different worlds, but which the novel makes a single world out of. And of course, there's everything. I mean, you learn the politics of the time, you learn about the communist movement, you learn about the partition, you learn about independence for two countries, you learn about, most importantly, about the people who were exploited and the people who were the exploiters of everything, from the landowning structures to how they took advantage of the partition and independence on both sides of the border. Primarily, of course, in what was East Pakistan then, because that is where the book is set, but also on the other side, you realize what is going on. So it is a book that you need to read across time, across space. And I don't know if I can do justice to a book like this with a short verbal description, but there it is. You can sense that I'm so struck by this book.
Yeah, of course. In fact, those of us who have read this book like 10 or 15 years back, we all of us writers in Bangladesh ended up reading it over and over again. And I know people who have read it more than 5 times. And because, these repeated readings are required not only to grasp the political and social and historical aspects of the book, but because the storytelling is so intricately done, just like you mentioned some of it, the boundaries of realities and dreams, they blur so often. And then the myth and the legends come in, like the myth of the Munshi, and who was a soldier under Bhavani Pathak and Fakir Muslusha, who basically fought during the Sepoy Mutiny against the East India Company. And then there are the folk singers Keramat Ali and Chiragali's Book of Dreams, which is the book within the book, as you put it. So yeah, so there are so many things happening, and some people would jump to the conclusion that this is magical realism happening here. But I totally agree with you. This is actually not magical realism in the way we conceive magical realism coming from Latin America, but this is something happening on a different level, which I think would be easier for readers from South Asia to grasp and understand. So many things are happening, so many issues, political, historical, and then all of these are looked at through the eyes of the characters. The omniscient narrator doesn't comment on most things. He rather makes us see things through the eyes of the characters, and especially Tommy's father, Tommy's, then the female characters, and then Keramat Ali, the folk singer. And there are lots of digressions. When Elias is exploring a character, he digresses and describes the psychological ups and downs and of the character, and places him in context as well. But then he comes back very swiftly to the main thread. So what I'm trying to ask you is, so much is happening in this novel. It is written on an epic scale. So I'm sure that you were faced with a lot of challenges. So what was the biggest challenge that you had to tackle while translating this epic?
To be honest, the biggest challenge was probably the parts in verse. Because, prose, you can still try to work out rhythms and cadences that can give you a sense of what it is like reading it in Bangla. But verse becomes very difficult, especially when you're talking about verse which is actually being sung. So these are lyrics.
Yes.
And you know that the moment you try to turn them into lyrics in English, your mind starts putting in a completely different kind of background to it, right? You start thinking of Western songs, and you start thinking of Western, musical notes that come from the West, and that kind of a musical score. So that I think was the biggest challenge, and I'm not sure that I've necessarily done the best possible job on it, but there it is. So that was one. Certainly the way the prose flows in terms of the structures of the sentences, some of them go on very long, and yet when you're reading, even though the sentences are long, you never really lose the thread. You know exactly what is happening in that particular sentence, even if it's running for half a page. So, ensuring that lucidity remains without your having to sacrifice the idea of complexity. And it's complex rather than complicated. So to protect both the complexity and the lucidity was certainly something of a very important requirement. But yet it's very obvious that if you don't do that, then you are not being respectful to Akhtaruzzaman Elias's prose, and you cannot do that in a translation, to my mind. So I think these were the two most important things. The other thing that was not a challenge for me so much, but I've got this feedback from readers who are not accustomed to South Asian or Bengali culture, is that they had trouble with the names. So this was a new thing for me, because for you and me, the names are very natural.
Right.
But it turned out that because there are so many different characters,
right,
and sometimes the names are only slightly different from one another. To us, they're not slightly different, they're very different. But right, to someone who is not familiar, they are somewhat similar. So I think, but that's not something you can do anything about. So it wasn't a challenge. I think it's a little bit of a challenge for the Western reader, perhaps. Right. Or even I got the same feedback from some readers in India as well. But that apart, the real thing was, and that's true for any text, but even more so in this text, which is that eventually does the translated text retain all the possibilities of the Bangla text? You cannot afford to narrow down anything or reduce anything. You cannot say this is what it means, because a great work in a single sentence in a great work of literature will never mean only one thing. So you have to make sure that it has the ability to mean exactly what the reader thinks it means, and let the reader make that choice rather than the translator making the choice on behalf of the reader in a different language. So that is something that one had to be even more conscious of in the case of this text.
Well, this last feedback of yours takes me to an aspect that I have been planning to ask you as a question. So you see, there are many in any other field of knowledge, there are several schools of thought in the area of translation as well. So some schools believe in being or remaining like religiously loyal to the original. On the other hand, some believe that there is nothing called a loyal translation. And given the complexities of Akhtaruzzaman Elias's text, um, is it possible that a lot of its nuances can be lost in translation? So if it is so, what do you think a translator should do to compensate for those losses, or how you actually tackled it if it happened that way?
I'll step back here for a moment. First of all, yes, it is most certainly possible that some nuances may not be conveyed adequately, or the new language in which the text now resides may not be capable of conveying some of those nuances altogether, simply because it does not have the same cultural association, not the same. I mean, you cannot push the same buttons in the reader's head because they belong to a different culture and a different history and even a different geography. I mean, something as simple as a reference to a river in a text written in South Asia, you know, any river, you will immediately start thinking of a very wide, vast river, right? Overflowing with water in monsoon, raining down to a trickle in summer. Now, let's say if a reader from a different geography were reading this, they would have no idea of this. For them, a river, I remember, you know, this is always a joke to me when I was visiting Norwich, a town in the UK, and they said, you know, that's where the river flows. So if you want to walk across, you can just go down this way. And I crossed a bridge several times before I realized that I had actually crossed the river, because to me, it was a creek. It was not even a creek. It was like a drain. It was not even a canal. It was so narrow. So when you use words like these, you are definitely not able to convey the same visual imagery, right? To someone who belongs to a different geography, you will just not be able to. So there's always that. And I don't know that you can do much about that. The other thing that happens is that very often in the West, translators translate into their own languages, into their mother tongue. So they are very much more conscious about what their own language can do and cannot do. And sometimes they will play with the text to accommodate what their own language can do, in this case, English. So, you know, you will not find someone whose mother tongue is English deliberately playing around too much with the English language. They will rather play around with the text so that it sits well in the English language. But for someone like us, who are in people like us in South Asia, we don't care so much about the sanctity of the English language, right? So we are able to expand it, make it more elastic, twist it more, and lend some Bengaliness to the language, at least for the duration of the translation. So that is sometimes a big advantage. These are things you can do. And while it may raise some eyebrows amongst readers, it is also important for us to remind readers that you're not reading a book that was written in your own backyard. So don't confuse this for an English language book. Just suspend your disbelief for a moment. Imagine it is written in English, but it's not. So you will hear and read here English that you are not familiar with. I think these things allow a little more of, much more, I think, of fealty to the original text. You can then stick closer to the original text, sometimes in terms of structure, in terms of syntax, in terms of sounds, words, etc., that you would normally not be able to do. But having said that, you know, a translator is only a reader. The translator may be a very, very attentive reader, but a translator is not every reader. They are one reader. So eventually a translator will also tend to take away, you know, their own version of the text that they have read.
Exactly.
And the richer a text is, there is always the worry that you may be missing out on some other possible versions. As I said earlier, your attempt is to allow the text to retain all its possibilities, all its richness. And sometimes the way to do it is by not investigating the text too much. Because the moment you start doing that and analyzing it, then you start getting into a very sharp version of it, which is perhaps not fair. So, you know, you need to maintain that largeness. So don't investigate the text so much, make it a problem of language rather than of literature. And that is what I did with Akhtaruzzaman Elias's book. I did not think of it as a work of literature. and therefore tried to make sure that all literary aspects of the text were being preserved. No, I looked upon it as a play of language. And I said, how can I be respectful and do justice to this play of language when I'm using a different language? That was the approach. That's in general my approach to all translation, but in this case, it was particularly important.
Very nicely said, brother. You see, this is one of those novels which is heavily ingrained in local culture. And to the extent that I find the act of storytelling to be influenced by many local forms. Even the first page and throughout the novel, sometimes while reading it, sometimes it seems like that I'm in a marketplace listening to an old man relating a story about his past, about what he had seen when he was a child. So let me just give you one example. Towards the very end of the novel, in your translation, it is on page 544. There's the sentence: a long time ago, when, never mind Tamiz's father, when Baghar Majhi's grandfather's father, or was it his grandfather, had barely been born or not, and even if he had, was only crawling about on the newly laid earth in the home built by clearing a part of the forest. Munshi had turned into a ghost after being killed by a soldier's bullet. So this descriptive detail, when never mind Tamiz's father, when Baghar Majhi's grandfather's father, or was it his grandfather, this particular descriptive detail has recurring presence from the very first page to the very last, and it happens throughout the novel. So this kind of nuances and recurring motifs. So how did you tackle them? I mean, did these come as a challenge, or did you have to? I read this book and I had a feeling that you had to stay alert all the time, and you had to be on the lookout for such repetitions, and then you had to try to make sure that you do justice to such intricate and subtle strategies.
Well, look, you inhabit any novel that you're translating. And Khwabnama is the kind of book which you have no choice but to inhabit, even as a reader. When you're reading Khwabnama, that's the world you're in. You're almost completely detached from any physical world that you may be part of. Secondly, as a translator, you pretty much remember what the text is. And you know that yourself, Rifat, you're a translator yourself. You know that when you're translating, you know the text, you know what lines when you're a reader, you may pass over them lightly, but when you're writing the words in another language, you remember exactly when phrases have recurred and sentences have recurred. And it's like singing. If you sing a tune, then you'll know it much more closely than if you're just listening to it. So nowadays, working as we do on our computers, this is actually not a difficult problem at all. You just go back to where it was and Command C, Command V, and that's it. It actually shortens your work, if anything. I mean, Elias Saab must have written it by hand twice over, even if he had to go and look at what he wrote the first time. So yeah, but of course, you're right. I mean, you must be aware, or you must remember, and not translate it differently the next time.
Yeah. So many critics argue that this is in Bangladesh. Many critics argue that this is one of the best novels written about the theme of 1947 partition of India. So, and we have also observed a renewed interest in literary and historical accounts on partition. So now that this book is translated, do you think that it has the potential to reach a wider audience in South Asia?
Most definitely, South Asia and everywhere else in the world. And what is also fascinating is that it appends the traditional narrative of the partition, which is so centered around religious clashes,
yes,
and so on, and the violence. this
Yes.
actually gives you a much truer and larger perspective, because
Larger.
those things tend to take it out of context and say this is all that there was to it. But you read this novel and you see it was a much larger picture. It was so much a bigger picture. It is definitely, as you say, I'm not fond of that term, but it is certainly a partition novel and needs to be studied and read as such. In fact, I do hope that it will make its way into syllabuses and into studies of both literature and history, certainly.
Yeah, I hope so too. But sometimes questions arise in my mind about the classics from South Asian countries reaching Western shores, because I have also interviewed. I did interview quite a few writers who attended Dhaka Lit Fest from the western part of the world about why some of the great classics from our part of the world, from South Asia, fail to attract publishers based in UK and USA. So their answers were rather frustrating for me, because they think that the issues that our novels talk about um, will not cater to the taste of Western audience. So what do you think about this vis-a-vis this novel? Does this novel have the potential to even attract Western publishers? What do you think?
I think to begin with, this whole notion of something being too far away from our world and therefore our readers will not be interested immediately implies that the Western world of English reading audiences is the center of the universe, or at least the center of the world, and that they're at the center and all of the rest of us are on the periphery trying to get a look in. But that is not the way to look at the world anymore, and certainly not the world of art and literature. Everything is valid. Everyone is the center and everyone is on the margins, right? So it is because publishers act as gatekeepers, and because publishing is driven so much by their, at this time in history, driven so much by their profit and loss accounts, where they take each book and they try to figure out how much money they can make from it, that they are not able to really take those, take what they think of as financial risks. 50 years ago, or 60, 70 years ago, publishers published what they thought were good books. And they published them knowing that they would publish 100 books and maybe only 10 of them would be commercially successful, but they could not tell which 10 those were. So they would publish all 100, and the 10 that were successful would ensure that all 100 could be published. It was the same with films. Then once big studios came in, and then that structure got replicated with big publishing, you started looking at each individual book. Now, does it cater to an audience? Does the audience want to read? So you are immediately cutting off the possibility of anything new. You're saying we will give readers the same thing over and over again in different guises because, hey, we know that's what they want to read. So you are doing a tremendous disservice to literature. You're not allowing new things to come in.
Exactly.
Right? And but having said that, Latin American literature did make its entry. There was a time when it was not part of the mainstream, but it came in. It came into a point where it became quite sought after by publishers. So South Asian literature has not yet reached that moment, perhaps because it does not have the right champions yet. Latin American literature was championed by people who had read in Spanish and therefore knew or Portuguese and knew the value and could say, yes, these should be translated and brought in. Here it's a chicken and egg scenario. They can't read it till it's translated. The translations will not happen till they're commissioned, and therefore it falls into a bottomless pit. But you know better than anybody else what fantastic works there are from even Bangladesh. Just if you take Bangladesh alone as a literature producing area of South Asia, there's enough literature from Bangladesh to last readers around the world for many, many years.
Exactly.
Right?
I believe so.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is actually where, the cultural authorities in Bangladesh can take the initiative, because I've seen that the reason, for example, literatures from Eastern Europe or Korea or China have made it to the Western world is because those countries' cultural authorities took an interest. They went out to book fairs. They established themselves as partner countries at the London Book Fair or the Frankfurt Book Fair and so on. And that immediately opened the gates for a lot of literature from their countries to be showcased over there. And then it arouses interest. The trouble also is that if you take one book or two, Khwabnama will have to speak for itself. It is such a fantastic book that it probably will. But what would be so great is if Khwabnama also made reading it, a publisher said, wow, can you show me 20 other books from this region? And you say, yes, here they are. Or 50 other books. That is what makes it. When after people read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, they said, wow, who are the other writers? And then you had this whole bunch of writers from South America who suddenly became visible, and we started reading all of them, right? Then it happened with Korean writers. And then it happened with, let's say, Eastern Asian writers, Polish and Hungarian, right, and so on. Right. So we need that moment. It happened for literature from India, it happened in the English language. Right. Because India was under colonial rule. So the literature that made its mark was written in English, the Arundhati Roys and Salman Rushdie's and Amitav Ghosh's. Right. But yeah, it has to. So I'm hoping that maybe Bangladesh is, and literature is such a big part of life in Bangladesh. It's perhaps the only country in the world which is built on the identity of a language. I don't think there's any other country which is also named for a language, right? Yes.
I think as more and more translations of this kind, I'm talking about Khwabnama and other such translations of yours and by other translators like Muhammad Rahman, Kaisar Haq, Shabnam Nadia, and there is also Ramaswamy. So as more and more translations of this quality, reach readers across the world, I think things will change. I'm also very much hopeful. But when you said what cultural authorities in Bangladesh should do in terms of putting in more efforts, you actually covered your answer to my last question. That was I was planning to put that as my last question. But okay, fine. So then I'll move on. My other two questions were almost towards the end of our time. So Arunava, very recently you have emerged as a translator of Bengali literature as well. I mean, you have started translating from English to Bengali. So you started with Ghachor Ghuchur, which happens to be a fantastic book, and I think that book also made it to the Booker International shortlist, if I'm recollecting it correctly. But then the most recent one, Bondukdeep, which is a Bengali translation of Amitav Ghosh's The Gun Island, a novel we all loved all across South Asia, I believe. So please tell us something about that experience. I mean, how did it feel to translate Gun Island in Bengali?
It was fantastic. I mean, Amitav Ghosh was one of the writers I idolized as a reader, not as someone who also wanted to write, but simply as a reader. And so in itself, the opportunity to translate him was a mind-blowing kind of opening. And I found this novel very, very exciting because to me, it's a novel for a new world. It is a novel for a post-apocalyptic world, or rather for a world where the apocalypse is actually engulfing us. And because we are caught in it like the frog in where the water is being boiled slowly, the frog does not realize that they're being burned. We ourselves don't realize that we are being burned by the climate apocalypse around us. And what Amitav Ghosh does in this novel is remarkable. On the one hand, he links the climate apocalypse to many political and social changes that are taking place around the world. For example, migration. One of the big themes of this novel is actually migration, and it shows how the two are linked. How because of the climate crisis in the land, on the water or the water nearby that you live in, you are forced to go to other parts of the world. And then it shows how that migration leads to a political pushback, because the political leaders of those countries do not want people from other countries to come in and take their jobs and so on. And then very excitingly, he links it to history, but it says that the language of nature is not always told through rational means. It is not always told through scientific formula, although science plays a crucial role for us in understanding climate change. But it says that stories and legends are where some truths of the world come out because history has already seen these situations. He talks about the mini ice age of the 17th century, and he goes back to the legend of
Chand Saudagar.
Chand Saudagar. He talks about the Saudagar who left the coast of Bengal, and he turns it into a detective story, something like Umberto Eco's, where it is through words that you discover the route that they took and therefore where they ended up. And I just don't want to give any spoilers, so I'm not going to mention specificities, because it is also a detective story, most remarkably. So he does all of these things, and he tells you that there is a different way to look at the world we live in. And this novel does a tremendous job of using fiction as a means. So also very fittingly, it is a story that tells us how to look at older stories and how to look at our current dire realities and see in them a pattern that we might not have seen otherwise. So Eta Bangla Kora was for me a tremendous opportunity. And it also, I felt that it was a homecoming for the novel, because much of the novel is set in Kolkata and West Bengal and a bit in Bangladesh, but also the characters, most of the characters are Bangla speaking people, because in this other part of the world, some of it is in America and then some of it is in Europe. And in the European parts, it turns out that many of the key figures are actually people from Bangladesh.
From Bangladesh, the migrant workers.
The migrant workers, exactly. So this novel is a Bangla novel in a sense, which was written in English. And therefore it's a homecoming.
Exactly. And I think to some extent, it continues the legacy of the Hungry Tide. Because
in a sense, I mean, what
the Sundarban is there, and how environmental degradation is affecting the Sundarbans. That part is also partly covered.
Partly covered, yeah. Although he says rightly, I think that this is not a sequel. It's just that when he started conceiving this novel, Sundarban automatically became a key location. And then he felt, since he had already written one novel set there, why not create a sense of continuity from it?
Right.
But it's not a sequel in that sense at all.
Now I'll get to a point which is going to be my last question. I would love to continue the discussion, but I think we're towards the very end. So last year, in November last year, I attended a workshop of editors and translators organized by Commonwealth Foundation, in which you appeared as a speaker. The two other speakers was Jeremy Tiang and
Deborah Smith.
Deborah Smith, yeah. So in your speech, you covered quite a few aspects. One of them was how we always, while talking about translation, we always highlight translating Bengali literature or any vernacular literatures into English, or maybe some other language, foreign language. And also about translating like French literature or English literature or Arabic literature into Bengali. But what we ignore in the process is that maybe an Indian English novel, maybe a Pakistani English novel, maybe, I mean, an English novel written by an Indian or a Sri Lankan citizen or a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi citizen for that matter, should also be translated into Bengali, or should also be translated into other vernacular languages of South Asia, into Nepalese language, into Tamil, into Kannada, in all these languages. So I think this is one of this is where also your translation of Bondudip is significant, because this is something we should explore more. What do you think about this?
Oh, absolutely.
I feel strongly. I mean, we always translate the Booker-winning novel, but we never talk about translating Kamila Shams's cartography into Bengali, or Kaisar Haq's poetry into Bengali, or Kaisar Haq's poetry into Tamil, or say. So same goes for Amitabh Ghosh and all the other.
Absolutely. Or for that matter, Khwabnama into Kannada.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
Example,
this is the point you covered.
And there's so much affinity between the languages. So absolutely. In fact, interestingly, the university where I teach, Ashoka University, we've just set up a center for translation there and one of our key missions is to ensure that there are translations of texts across the languages of South Asia, between and across.
Fantastic.
And not just into English, which is what the publishing world dictates. So we want to break that structure and get into a different kind of scenario.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much, Arunava. Thank you for giving us this time and enriching us with your feedback on Khwabnama and your thoughts about translation. And we look forward to getting more and more of your wonderful translations of Bengali.
Thank you so much, Rifat. And I can't tell you how grateful I am and also how proud I am that Bangladesh, which I consider my motherland, has given us works like Khwabnama. It makes me truly proud to be a citizen of the world.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.